Okay, so it's race morning and we need to start thinking about what we're going to have for breakfast before the race. So in the last video, we talked about the different type of carbohydrates. So on the one hand, we've got your white carbs, which are fast release, quickly into your system. On the other hand, we've got the brown or beige carbs, things like wholemeal rice, wholemeal pastas, brown bread, things like that. In the morning of the race, what we want to or the approach that we probably want to take is a bit of a combination of the two. So something like porridge oats, which are going to be slow release and going to release energy throughout the morning into our body from the gut, is absolutely perfect. And we can combine that with some white carbohydrates, something like a white bagel with jam and peanut butter. It is perfect. We can also have energy bars if that's what we like. Even gels, if you want to get on those really early, then there's no issue with that at all. But what we're aiming for here is about 2 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight. So as an example, I'm about 75 kilos, so I'm aiming before the race and mainly at breakfast to eat about 150 grams of carbohydrate. So again, we need to formulate a plan to actually achieve that and think about the foods and how much of those foods is actually going to get us to that magic number, let's say. And ideally we want to eat around 2.5 to 3 hours before the race actually starts. Little tip, I would actually have some of my breakfast, like the porridge and maybe a bagel, while I'm in the hotel room or at my house before the race. I'll take an energy bar with me and have that in transition as I'm setting up my gear, maybe 65, 70, 75 minutes before the race. And then about 15 minutes before the race, just before I'm about to go and start the swim, then I'll have an energy gel. Just that last little bit of energy into the system. That means I'm really fully topped up, ready to race. So what about during the race? Now, you can go on any website and look at the guidelines for carbohydrate intake for endurance events lasting longer than 2 or 3 hours in duration. And hopefully you're all or have some awareness. A minimum of 60 grams of carbs per hour, up to around 90, even 95, 100 grams of carbs per hour. When we're looking at those top end of the range for carbohydrate intake, that really needs to have been practiced in training beforehand. So whilst I'm suggesting these numbers, don't deviate at this point from anything that you haven't tried in training. And we'll look at gut training, how that can improve the amount of carbohydrate that we can take on board during a race at a later date. So these are the general guidelines for carbohydrate intake. Obviously, we can take out the swim. We're not going to be taking on board any carbs during that. So it falls onto the bike, the run, and then the second bike leg to fuel where we're going to fuel the race and fuel our performance. So some tips in terms of how we might actually achieve this specifically in the rock, because of its unique challenges in terms of ascending and then descending a mountain. So the critical thing is when we come out of the swim, what we're going to need to do when we get on the bike is start to fuel immediately. Don't wait sort of 10 or 15 minutes. Straight onto some carb drink would be absolutely ideal because the heart rate is going to be raised a little bit, and therefore we want to start taking on board carbs as quickly as we can. So during that first 5, 10, 15 minutes of the bike, when the heart rate's a little bit elevated, then you can go to a carbohydrate drink is an easy way to start taking on board some carbohydrate to fuel your performance. As we continue through the bike leg, then we can start to rely on things like shot blocks are a great example. Energy gels, we can go with energy drinks, anything like that. Energy bars, whatever we've practiced in training. But the key thing here is that during that first bike leg, we really need to take on as many carbs as we think we can handle and tolerate, because when we come off the bike, we can start to ascend the mountain, then there's going to be limited or more limited opportunities to actually fuel what we're doing. So really take into account and plan what you're going to eat during that first bike leg and make sure that you are on top of your nutrition at that point, because that's going to dictate how you're able to get up and down the mountain to a large extent, and then the second bike leg when we come back to Abersoch. So when we get to the foot of the mountain, we're putting on our sack, so we need to make sure that we've got some snacks in there, carbohydrate rich snacks, and also some fluid in there as well. Again, there's limited opportunities when we're trying to work fairly hard going up a mountain to take on board fuel. But that being said, it's about thinking about the day as a whole. So it's really important that we actually do, when the moment arises, as we're going ascending the mountain, we take on board some carbohydrates. And again, that's in the form of energy gels, drinks, energy bars, whatever we need. We need to, again, stay on top of that nutrition as best we can while we ascend the mountain. Because when we're coming back down and we're descending, that's when we really need to focus on what we're doing. So our legs are going to take us down the mountain quite nicely, but we need to be in good shape when we get to the bottom of the mountain to get back on that bike and get us back to Abersoch in a good time. So again, fuel on the way up, try to fuel on the way down as best we can. But we've also got to be mindful that there's some sketchy parts of the mountain that we're coming down. So we've got to be careful and take on board fuel at the right time. But again, don't neglect this. When we get back on the bike, the first 20 or 30 minutes of that bike leg, again, are going to be really critical to how we end the race. So hopefully you've left enough fuel on board for the return to Abersoch, and that's when you get stuck into that fuel, those carbs, on that sort of first 20 to 30 minutes of the ride. Because if we're not on top of things then, we're starting to really deplete our levels of carbohydrates in the body by that point, and the last hour of the bike is going to be horrific if we're not on top of our fueling at that point. So it's really about thinking about the race as a whole, not each leg individually and fueling each leg individually, but ultimately fueling the next leg that you're going to do. So the bike, taking on board nutrition on the first bike, is fueling our ascent and descent of the mountain. What we're doing on the mountain when we're going up and coming down is fueling the second bike leg. And the second bike leg, the first part of that, is really critical to ensure we've got sufficient energy to take us back to Abersoch and that final 1k run to see us over the line. So related to that, we've got to think about how much carbohydrate we need to store on our bike to get us to the foot of the mountain and then back to town as well. So make sure we've got enough on board and make use of the aid stations to take on extra where appropriate. So make sure we've got enough fuel to get us back into town for that last run. The final thing, hydration. So typically we would recommend 600 to 1,000 mils per hour of fluid, and that can be electrolyte drinks, that can be carbohydrate drinks as well. Keeping on top of that, again, is really important because dehydration can really influence the back end of our performance. If that becomes a factor, then it really becomes a struggle to recover from that. So staying on top of fueling and hydration is going to be fundamental to how the day pans out for you. Obviously, those numbers are very individual. Some people have high sweat rates, some people much lower. So it's about being in tune with your body, making sure you're staying on top of the hydration, and don't allow yourselves to become thirsty because it's almost too late at that point. Obviously, if it's a really warm day, then we need to increase the amount of fluid that we're taking on board. If it's a cooler day, we can probably get away with a little bit less at the lower end of that range, 600 to 700 mils. Again, the same point that I made in my previous video, have a plan and try and execute that plan as best you can on race day, independent of what's going on around you. Those that do that will be the most successful in the race, and whatever success means to you in that race, and you'll have a great day. But just take on board that fuel, stay on top of the fueling, stay on top of the hydration, and you'll be coming over that finish line in Abersoch with a smile on your face.